Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. For my guest segment today, I am joined by Zach, the host of the Plaid Jacket Philosopher podcast. Thank you for coming on the show today, man. How you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty well. We were talking a little bit pre-recording, but it sounds like we both got some smoke settling in our valley. So I'm
Yes.
looking forward to that over the next week. But other than that, it's good. I can't complain. We're in the middle of a bit of a heat wave here and sweating at work, but whatever. What can I do?
Yeah, speaking of which, before we kind of dive into the questions here, just could you tell everyone like what part of the world you're in? I think you're my first international guest. I have to think here.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm honored. I'm from just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. So I'm about an hour to an hour and a half northeast of Vancouver, in the Fraser Valley. So yeah, coming from the Great White North, although it's not very white or very cold right now.
Yes, my first Canadian guest. I do appreciate you coming on. And when I was checking out your podcast previously, I kind of noticed that you had a little bit of a different feel from some other podcasts that I've listened to before, especially with what the emphasis is behind your podcast. And so, as is custom, whenever a fellow podcaster comes on my podcast, I always ask them the same question, which is, what was the motivation behind starting the Plaid Jacket Philosopher? Just tell me a little bit about how it started and why this was an important subject for you.
Yeah, thanks. To be honest, most of it was, I've talked about it in some of my previous kind of early podcast episodes, but I'd spent a lot of time working up north in the oil fields or in mining. So that was underground mining and tunneling. And that was, it was rotation work. So I was on for anywhere between 2 weeks to 4 weeks on shift at a time. That'd be away from home. And then I would come home for, anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks on my rotations off. So what I really found was while I was out of town, you really end up leaning on your bunkmates, your coworkers, the guys that you're spending, again, every waking hour with for between 2 and 4 weeks. You have very spotty cell service. No cell service, but it's usually satellite internet and satellite phones. And those are unreliable at the best of times. So a lot of the time you don't have much contact with the outer world, and you really start to lean on each other is what I found. Like you develop, I don't know of a better word to describe it other than kind of brotherhood. You really end up leaning on each other. And, after the first week goes by and you've kind of gotten all the pleasantries out of the way and what's happened on your time off, real life starts to set in. You may have problems going on at home, but you can't talk to people at home at that time. And so you end up really discussing them and getting into a lot of deeper topics with the guys around you. And it was just something that I wanted to try to highlight on this podcast, is because, you look in media and you see the plumber walks in on a sitcom and they, their pants hanging halfway down their butt, and, they might grunt and groan a few things, but that's all that you ever see of tradespeople. And so I wanted to try to highlight that, there's a lot of deeper thought, a lot of pride that's taken in working with your hands, in being able to build something, see a project through. And that was really the inspiration for this podcast.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. It is a stereotype that we see in society. It feels as though, this is not just unique for people in this particular trade industry, but, many other jobs have been more or less stereotyped about what we believe that their lives are like or who they are as people, so on and so forth. So the question that I have for you is, when you do talk about these issues on your podcast, how exactly do you break them down? Like if someone were to come to your podcast, what could they expect from one of your episodes?
Well, like any podcast, you're figuring it out as you go along. I think, at least for me, I'm an amateur podcaster, but now like I'm trying to transition into just highlighting kind of the work ethic, the values, the kind of the feeling of accomplishment that you can get from working with your hands. I've had the one thing that's kind of been most inspiring to me is being reached out to by younger apprentices, kind of guys who are between 18 to 24, who've been reaching out and saying like, I like this message. And, either they've just started into the trade or they've been in it for a year or two. And, it's tough to kind of see a grander view of it, that if you're just working in the mud and the muck and you're kind of a low level employee. But I try to kind of spread that message that I know, at least when I was an apprentice, it's, the earliest years are the toughest, but you can
Yeah.
really, you can build your career up from that literally with your own two hands. There's very little obstacles in the way of it as far as post-secondary training. You don't have to take on a big student loan to get into this. And
Right.
it's just the idea of, the work ethic and the morals and kind of the values of working with your hands and of, the camaraderie that comes with working in a workforce.
Right. And so I guess there does seem to be somewhat of a stigma attached to these more blue collar jobs.
Yep.
I think that there's always been this heavy emphasis on people going to college, and not enough people really advocate for trade schools. I mean, we even hear this through the way politicians speak. They're always talking about, we should be expanding college, or we should be talking about who should be paying for college, but the conversations rarely ever get into the aspects of whether or not we should be expanding access to trade schools or incentivizing people to go into trade schools. Just in your opinion, what should the narrative be around these blue collar jobs as someone who is involved in this field?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that it's not like I refer to it, as a job. I use job and career interchangeably fairly often, but the realization that it is a career, that this isn't just a job that you can, if you want to pick up a few extra bucks while you're going to university, you can get into a laborer field. That's definitely not going to give you the best taste in your mouth as far as what trades are, because that is the lowest level position. But it really is a career, and you can build it up with, like I said, very little overhead. As far as schooling goes, it obviously depends on the course. Like aerospace technicians or an aircraft mechanic, they're going to have a little bit more overhead. There's a lot more time spent in shop, tools, all that stuff. But as far as the construction trades, you're talking about carpenters, plumbers, electricians, welders, anything like that. Those careers can very easily net you, a six-figure plus income. And the fact that it isn't advertised that way, that it's, if you don't get a post-secondary degree in university or college, then you're hooped. That's kind of the message that I was conveyed in high school. It's just not true. Like, there is a real career here in trades. And the one thing that, is very prevalent in trades is that if you're training somebody, you're ultimately training them to go off on their own, because it is quite easy to go off on your own, be an independent contractor. And there's a lot of freedom that's afforded with that too.
Yeah. And, kind of like getting a little bit outside of that, because it does seem as though, when we are hearing about this, like I was saying before, with politicians, they just do not really talk about trade schools enough. And then when we hear about this in society, we're not really hearing about the advantageousness of being a part of some of these fields. But, kind of like stepping away from that a little bit, I know that besides those topics, you also do occasionally talk about politics, which perfectly aligns, with what I kind of do here at Independent Thought.
Yep.
And so the question I have for you is, when you do decide to discuss politics on your podcast, what types of topics do you like to discuss?
To me, I think I would target what I would consider probably bipartisan topics. I'm not, that's one thing that drives me nuts about, the news in general, just the way that it's all given. It's handed to you with an opinion attached to it from either side. And I'm not saying either side is more guilty of it than the other. I think it's, it's news entertainment for a reason. I think it carries with it a messaging and the way you're supposed to feel by the news, rather than just the news itself. And then you can develop your own opinion of it. But when for me, for example, right now in Canada, we've got two bills that are going through the House. That's Bill C-10 and Bill C-36, which both regard to or refer to free speech and different penalties that are now going to be attached to different forms of speech and all that stuff. And that's what draws my attention the most. It's one of the things that I kind of hold in the highest regard, is the idea of free speech and free and open discourse. It's part of why you start a podcast, right? You want to be able to talk about this stuff. So that's kind of the stuff that really draws me in politically. There's not much else that really interests me too much. It's funny. I have probably two political podcasts that I listen to, and it's Independent Thought, and then there's one other one that I can't remember off the top of my head. But like, I enjoy it in bite-sized amounts, but it's not something that I don't think I spend a ton of my time or thought process really focusing energy on that. But that's where I'm really drawn to it mostly, is usually when it comes to freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech is a very, very hotly debated topic right about now,
I know.
especially as we are talking about the dreaded cancel culture. It
Yeah.
seems like when you're talking about cancel culture or just maybe the broader topic of censorship in general, but kind of again transitioning into cancel culture, it's been a very consistently debated topic. I would say on both sides, when we're talking about tech platforms and them censoring politicians, or just how people have been able to speak about, I guess, how about the pandemic? We've been seeing that has also been policed very heavily. And the question that kind of comes to my mind is, well, there's several questions come to my mind when it comes to cancel culture. But I think when we
Right.
were speaking before, you had referenced something that you like to call headline culture. And
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting distinction that you were trying to make. So could you explain to me a little bit more in detail, what is the difference between what you would call headline culture versus cancel culture?
Well, I can't take credit for this one. It was actually a guest that I had on who introduced me to the idea of headline culture, but
Yeah.
I loved it. So what he was referring to, and what I think it applies to perfectly. So cancel culture is obviously wanting to delete people for their opinions, whereas headline culture is, and this seems to be as big of an issue as cancel culture to me, is the fact that people won't dig into a story anymore. You'll see a headline scroll through your news feed, and people just react to the headline. For example, one that really sticks out to me, and it's a recent pop culture example that I think most people will understand, was the idea of the cancellation of the Dr. Seuss books, right? When people looked at this headline, they said, oh my God, like, why are we canceling Dr. Seuss? Like, this is insane. Let's look at what else is out there in pop culture. Well, if you read the article, you would realize that it was the own publisher pulling their own material. Nobody was actually forcing them or telling them that you can't put this out. And the fact that there was such an uproar over this non-story, it was only because of the way that the headlines were worded. And that's, to me, that's one of the most kind of indicting examples of it. Is it's like really all it takes you is one click and you can read through this article, get a few of the facts. It's not like they're being canceled or the books are being burnt. That's not it. They had a few words that are questionable. Like the other thing too is you've got to think of the audience when you're talking about Dr. Seuss books. Like, I have a really hard time with people who want to cancel, for example, comedians, because that material is meant as a joke, and it's aimed at adults. You're not going to really sway their opinions so much. You're not going to change any biases that they have. But if you're talking about children's books, like, we should kind of be cognizant of what we're teaching them, because that is when you're most impressionable. And so, yeah, the uproar over the air quote cancellation of Dr. Seuss books was, kind of a prime example of that headline culture to me.
You are absolutely correct. And I will going to go on a very small little rant here, but
Okay.
I feel as though part of the Dr. Seuss thing that happened, this was like back in March of this year.
Mm-hmm.
It's very obnoxious to me because we have most people who don't spend a whole lot of time being engaged with politics on a day in and day out basis. And honestly, rightly, you probably shouldn't, because it'll drive you crazy. It drives me crazy, but then you have the people who are constantly engaging, and some of these people decide to take stories that aren't stories, but manipulate them to create hysteria for their own benefit, whether it's for clicks or ad revenue, so on and so forth. And so that stuff always drives me crazy, because it feels like there are just certain people within the media, whether it's independent media sphere in YouTube or mainstream media sphere on cable or in publications, who just take stories like this and just blow them way out of proportion for the sake of just trying to create viral moments, trying to create, eyeballs on their product. And it is really gross. And then I feel like they don't just do it with stories like that, which are what you would call culture issues,
Yeah.
but they also do it with legislation, and sometimes, so you'll get a lot of misleading headlines that fall around things like Medicare for all, or defund the police, or universal basic income,
Mm-hmm.
which was a very hotly debated topic during the primary season here in America, just like 2019, 2020, when Andrew Yang was running for president.
Yep.
You and I briefly spoke about this. You have some thoughts on universal basic income. Could you just tell me briefly Do you think that universal basic income is a good idea for people going forward? Like, why or why not?
I think it would be a really interesting experiment, one that I think, we're kind of toying with when it comes to the COVID relief benefit, right? Like I think that there are some similarities there. I think it would be
Yeah.
very easy to roll over that COVID benefit into a UBI. But to me, and again, because this is it feels like a bipartisan issue. Like you've got a hard right line and you've got a hard left line. It's
Yeah.
not something that I really, I'm not attached to either side on it. To me, it's just an interesting thought experiment because the two arguments basically seem to boil down to, from the left, you've got a UBI would allow for a lot more entrepreneurial ventures. It would allow for people's creativity to bloom. It would allow for, hopefully the flourishing of ideas and different creations. That's the idea. And which maybe it will. I'm not saying it wouldn't. And then the other side is that, it may put everything to a halt. You may have people who aren't going to actively try to, I don't know, contribute to society, or yeah, basically just the antithesis of that you aren't going to have people who want to contribute, who want to do anything. But I mean, at the bottom line of UBI is that it would hopefully raise everybody out of poverty, which I think
Right.
is something that is obviously great. It should be tried for. And I mean, yeah, I think there's got to be a lot of spending cuts in order to make that work. I know that in the States, a lot of the budget is spent on military. In Canada, not so much. So it'd be interesting to see how they kind of made that all work. But to me, it comes down to those two kind of lines of thought. And I don't know where, I mean, I think I would kind of, I'm worried about it. I think in just I don't know what the effects would be on society. I mean, I think anytime we try to institute anything new, a grand idea like UBI, I'm
Yeah.
always worried about maybe the things that we didn't think about, or the shortcomings of it. That's it. It's not that, but I wouldn't say that I'm hardline against it. I don't know. I'm wary of it a little bit, I think.
It's a very it's a very new concept. There
Yeah.
are certain locations, I think, most notably, I think Stockton, California, and I think maybe Long Beach as well, if I'm remembering correctly, have tried this out. They gave some residents $500 a month, I believe. And from the data that they were able to collect, it seemed like it had an overall positive, effect. But, with anything like that, you probably want to see it tested on larger scales and multiple different locations outside of just one state before you could definitively say like, yes, this works or no, it doesn't. But it intrigues me, but I think some of the arguments against universal basic income have kind of fallen along the lines of, again, people will get lazy, they won't want to work, so on and so forth. And it just, honestly, it feels like it breaks down to someone's political ideology.
Yeah.
And I know that everyone kind of has their own. I think when we were talking about political ideology, you were telling me that for you, you feel really rooted in the idea of personal responsibility.
Yep.
And tell me, kind of like in your own words, like what exactly does that mean and how does that relate to politics?
Well, for me personally, all it is like I like to have a say in things. I like to, at least in my own life. That's all I mean. I don't want to have input or influence on anybody else's life. But to me, the idea of, if I can raise myself up, it helps me to then help others around me. I mean, we were talking off mic, but like I have a lot of siblings, and
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to get into the housing market, for example, before it absolutely exploded in 2015. Locally, it went through the roof. So I was lucky in that sense. But the idea of personal responsibility is just the idea that you're responsible for your own life, for your own income. And again, that may roll into the idea of UBI and why I may be a little bit hesitant on just as far as where my compass is. But at the same time, I think that if you can build yourself up, it starts to have kind of a ripple effect around you. You're able to help people around you. They're able to help others, and it just expands from there. But I think the root cause of it, it's always, it's like you want to tend to your own garden before you go to your neighbors, right? It's the idea of trying to build yourself up, and then you're able to help others around you is really the way I view it. Maybe that's a little bit utopian, and not everybody would think that way, but that's my mentality as far as it goes with personal responsibility.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I understand how you get there. You know, the thing that I'm always interested about whenever I hear conversations about personal responsibility, it always feels like it's rooted in a very partisan way here in America.
Yeah.
And I think it might be a little unfair to kind of to lump it into a box like that. But you know, when I was having this conversation with you, you know, we were speaking about more or less the differences between politics in our separate countries here, and you were referencing how sometimes what happens here in America actually can influence what happens in Canada as far
Oh
as
yeah.
politics are concerned, which again, maybe arrogant American here, but I just never even thought to myself. I mean, I guess in some way, you know that America has an influence on the rest of the world, but we don't really actively think about it. Like, how is what's happening with Donald Trump affecting, you know, like Canada, or how is it affecting Chile, or how's it affecting, you know, Nicaragua? Like, I don't really think like that, but how does American politics, I guess, like seep into Canada more or less?
Well, the saying up here anyway is, America sneezes and Canada catches a cold. So it definitely, it definitely has an influence on us. Um, I can remember in particular, I guess it would have been 2016 when Trump was nominated or voted in, but I was blown away by, for example, the number of Trump flags in Canada, which to me,
Really?
yeah, look, the look on your face right now is the look I had in 2016. Because, and to me, like, okay, so in regards to American politics, I find it, as we were talking about earlier, almost like entertainment news. Like
Yeah.
I view it. It's like my reality TV, right? Because it doesn't directly affect me. It'll have kind of reverberating impacts on me, but nothing direct. So, but yeah, what was amazing to me is the fact that all these Trump flags are flying around Canada, and they have literally zero input, and they will get zero output out of what happens there. And yeah, so it definitely does. It definitely does influence it. It's really laughable sometimes, to be honest, because we
Yeah.
have no say in it.
Yeah. It's interesting to think that way. I would laugh if I was driving through Canada. I saw a bunch of Trump flags.
I did, yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. It kind of, it puts a whole different perspective on it. Cause I know that, you know, we talk about being this global superpower, these, you know, things that are floated around here in America, especially throughout the news, or especially Fox News talks about, you know, American supremacy, so on and so forth. But it's a little weird to actually hear that it does have that kind of an outreach here. But, you know, speaking about the news in a different sense, I think one of the last things I wanted to ask you here was, you know, when it comes to the news itself, there's been so many different stories that have kind of flown out this year. You know, obviously the pandemic is still going on. You know, here in America, we're talking about police brutality, climate change, you know, so on and so forth. But uh, from your personal perspective, has there been a story that's particularly caught your attention this year?
Oh, absolutely. The one that has probably been the biggest, yeah, I think it sparked originally a couple of months ago, was the discovery of the 215 bodies at the residential school system in Canada.
Yeah,
That was just outside of Kamloops, BC, which is about, for reference, 3.5 hours from me. So it's quite close, right?
right.
215 children's bodies were found, some as young as 3. And it really sparked, it sparked outrage, understandably so, across the country. And I recently had an interview actually with a guy from Scotland, and realized that the story is out there as well. So that kind of just reaffirmed that this story has gone global, right? And since that discovery a couple of months ago, I pulled up some facts on this because I wanted to get it straight. But so we had 139 residential schools in Canada, and the last
Yeah,
one closed down in 1996. So I was 7 years old. That's my
right.
lifetime. Which, when I found that out, and I'll just give a brief rundown of this. But so, of those 139 schools, 8 of them have now been searched, and so far there have been 1,665 children's bodies found in those 8 out of the 139 schools. The other thing to keep in mind here too is that the residential school system was also in place in the States. I believe there's about 350 schools in the States. I don't know what the status is on the searching of those grounds, but the part that I think floored me the most, and I actually did a podcast episode on it that was almost more reactionary. It wasn't one of my typical episodes, but I was pissed because really in high school, I think the residential school system was at most a chapter in a textbook, and realistically probably a couple of paragraphs, and that's about it.
Right.
And like I said, it closed when I was 7 years old, so it's not like this is ancient history. This is
Right.
I don't even know if this can be classified as history yet when you're talking about maybe one generation removed. And as far as the impacts on the families who were in those school systems, that's still being profoundly felt. And so to me, yeah, that story was definitely the most eye-opening. Sparked a lot of backlash, like I said it should. And for me anyway, like I started digging into as many facts as I could. I've read a couple of firsthand accounts on people who went through the school system, trying to get, acclimated with the story. But yeah, like it was crazy to read that this had been somehow hidden. And again, like through high school, we have Canadian social studies, and again, there was nothing in there. And I'm fortunate. Nobody in my family has been directly impacted by it, because I started to reach out and I got some feedback from that episode. And, some people were like, well, how didn't you know about this? And I was like, well, we didn't learn about it, and nobody in my family was impacted by it. So it pissed me off that we had never learned about it. It got me reading, got me researching. And so if anything, I think that's the one positive that can be pulled from this story, is hopefully people do start to look into it, do start to read a little bit more. But yeah, that story definitely hit me the hardest.
Rightly so. I mean, it's a stain not just on a nation, but on everyone involved in it. And
Yeah.
we haven't seen evidence of remains here in America, nor do I know if those schools have been searched, at the time of this recording, but they should be. There's no reason why they shouldn't be, especially if, they've gone through 8 schools in Canada, and each one of them, they were able to find the remains of, small children there, that you would think that'd be enough evidence for everyone to kind of just search everything all at once.
Yeah, they're averaging 208 kids roughly per school that they've searched, right? Which is insane. And I mean, it's a disturbing, it's a nuanced topic, but I mean, for example, there's discussion. There was obviously tuberculosis outbreaks at the time, and I don't think that the intention of the schools, the explicit intention of the schools, was to kill the Indian and the child, and that's verbatim. That's what the point of the whole school was. It was a cultural genocide. I don't know that. It's tough to talk about. I don't know. I don't think that it was a systematic targeted killing of people, but it was absolutely and explicitly trying to wipe out a culture. They were trying to, again, to their words, kill the Indian and the child. So
it's a cultural erasure. I mean,
yeah.
In every way, shape, and form. It is definitely deserves some more spotlight. I think I probably need to do an episode on it myself. It's just an ugly stain on North American history. And, thank you for covering that in your podcast. Because again, subjects like this definitely need to have more attention brought on them, more eyeballs brought on them, or I guess ears in this case, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Oh, I know.
As we're closing this out, just tell everyone really quickly, like why should they come check out your podcast?
Well, I really try to have interesting guests on, people who you may not consider to have a fascinating story. One guy that I had on, and again, I really like to highlight these ideas of people really kind of going against the odds, to really finding the fortitude to pull themselves up out of something. So for example, I had one guest on, Marshall, who, he was 16 living out of his car when him and his then girlfriend had their first kid. They were living out of a car for the first 8 months of his life. Now they're married. They've got 4 kids. They're doing amazing. So we touched on that story. Then I had a golfer, Dustin, who's going with Paragolf Canada. He had a spinal injury that paralyzed him at the age of 31. And now he's on his way back. He's golfing. Like, I just really like to highlight some of these stories from people that you may never have expected. Trades workers who have incredible stories of overcoming stuff, and just, hopefully a little bit of hope, a little bit of motivation, and maybe just a different look at tradespeople and blue collar life than you're accustomed to.
I love it. Zach, tell everyone where they can find you, like online, where they can find your podcast. Just give us a few different places where we can reach you at.
Yeah, thank you. I'm at Plaid Jacket Philosopher on Instagram. I have a Facebook page. It's the Plaid Jacket Philosopher podcast. And then on Twitter, I'm at Jacket Plaid. Although I'm not going to lie, I suck at Twitter. So I'm probably better on Instagram if you're going to follow me anywhere. But yeah, that's where you can find me. I'm on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, a bunch of the big ones. So you can search up Plaid Jacket Philosopher anywhere, and it should pop up.
All right, everyone. If you are interested in keeping up with Zach or the podcast, there will be some links in the description. So go ahead and go into the description of the episode right now, and you should see some links there for you. Appreciate you coming on the show today, man. Thank you for coming on. You are welcome back anytime. For everyone else, we're going to take one final break, and I'll be right back with my final thoughts of the day. Stay tuned.